They said it was just a routine check. She was standing alone in line, quiet, composed, and as ordinary as anyone could seem at first glance. Her coat, a faded gray wool blend, had clearly seen winters in more than one state. Her shoes were polished. Her hair, silver but neatly pulled back, didn't move even as the wind howled through the entry vestibule each time the glass doors opened. Her name was Margaret Elaine Carter, and she was 74 years old. The line for security wound its way through the federal building lobby. Slow, mechanical, full of sighs and shuffling feet. Younger people stared at phones. Parents whispered warnings to children. And Margaret simply waited, back straight, hands folded. She looked like someone's grandmother visiting Social Security, or maybe DMV, one of those places where people forget the government is made of people. But then came the voice. "Ma'am, step aside, please. Right over here." It was Officer Rustin, young, brash, barely in his 30s, with a tactical haircut and a badge that gleamed just a little too brightly under the fluorescent lights. He didn't shout, but his voice cut through the low murmurs of the lobby like a sharp edge. Margaret didn't flinch. She turned, nodded once, and stepped aside. Another officer joined in, this one older, broader across the chest, with a nameplate that read S. Lorette. His uniform was crisp, his eyes less aggressive but no more kind. "Do you have ID?" "Yes, I do," she said calmly, pulling a weathered identification card from a worn leather wallet. Officer Rustin took it and turned it over like he was holding something suspicious. The lamination was yellowed, the photo faded but still legible. He frowned. "This is expired. I was told it would still be accepted," Margaret replied. Her voice was quiet but firm. "I have an appointment." "An appointment for what?" There was a pause, not long, just a breath. But it changed something. "It's a personal matter." That did it. The answer wasn't defiant. It wasn't suspicious. But in the rigid world of badge and scanner, personal was a word that didn't sit well. Rustin leaned slightly toward Lorette, who gave a small nod. "We'll need to screen her bag." Margaret's eyes dropped to the duffel at her feet. A soft canvas bag, old but clean. It didn't match the roller suitcase most travelers carried. It looked like it belonged to another time, another life. "May I request a private screening?" she asked. The younger officer didn't even try to hide his smirk. "No, Mom. We'll do this here," he said, "Ma'am," like it was a formality, not respect. The table they brought her to was metal. Cold. Just under the main security arch, people were now slowing down in the line, curious, watching. Rustin gestured to the bag. "Open it." She hesitated, not out of fear, but consideration, then unzipped it halfway. "I would still prefer some privacy. And I'd prefer full cooperation." Rustin shot back. The way he said it wasn't harsh. It wasn't even loud, but it was full of something worse, performance. Phones were beginning to lift in the crowd. Margaret stepped back. "Very well." Rustin snapped on his gloves. Not sound echoed, intentional, and people noticed. He began pulling items out of her bag, one by one, laying them on the table like evidence in a case no one had explained. A framed photograph, face down, a prescription bottle with the label worn, a book, In Memoriam, by Tennyson, its spine cracked from use, a faded handkerchief, a sealed envelope with a government seal unopened, traveling light. "Lorette Mutterf," Margaret said. Then Rustin pulled out something small, a key, but not the kind that opens a front door. This one was ornate, heavy, etched with a design that looked European, old, symbolic. "What's this open?" he asked. "Something that should have stayed closed," she said without missing a beat. There was laughter from the officers, a snort from someone behind the table. Someone said, "Spee movie grandma," under their breath. Rustin held up a letter next, a medical form, the kind that's supposed to stay private. It had test results printed in faded ink. He waved it without reading. Then came a small box, inside a single metal pin, simple, heavy. No label. "Souvenir," Rustin asked, flipping it in his palm. "A reminder?" Margaret replied. "Off what?" "People who didn't come back." For the first time, the room grew quiet. Not silent, but still. Even the air seemed heavier. There was one compartment left. A zippered section at the bottom of the bag, stitched closed with thick seams, barely noticeable. Rustin's fingers hovered above it. "Anything else in here we should know about?" Just things that belong to me, Margaret said. That's all. He pulled the zipper slowly. The sound echoed like a blade being drawn. Inside was a folded piece of fabric, deep navy blue, the kind not seen in store-bought clothing. Rustin pulled it out, shaking it open lazily. Several people gasped. It wasn't a jacket, it was a uniform. Not ceremonial, but one preserved, maintained. Pressed so perfectly it might have been folded that morning. Rustin laughed at first, until he saw the patches, the insignia, the medals. Some were familiar, others weren't. Lorette leaned closer. I don't recognize these, he murmured. You wouldn't? Margaret said softly.
What is this, a costume?
Rustin asked. Not a costume, she replied. It was issued. Be who? You don't have the clearance. The words landed differently now. No longer part of a game. Someone in the line stepped forward, an older man, veteran hat in hand. Those aren't fake, he said. I've seen that patch before. Back in 73 Eastern Bloc operations. That's real, Rustin snapped. Sir, step back. But it was too late. The mood had changed. What had begun as theater was unraveling into something very real. As Rustin held the jacket awkwardly, a man in full military dress entered from the side hallway. His posture was unmistakable. So were the 4 stars on his shoulder. The crowd parted almost instinctively as he approached. He stopped in front of the table. Officer, he said calmly, but firmly. Is that Captain Carter's uniform you're holding? Rustin blinked. His throat bobbed. Sir, we were just conducting a routine. The general cut him off with a glance, then turned to Margaret. Captain Carter, it's been too long. Margaret gave the smallest of nods. General Mallory. 41 years, I believe. And then they saluted. The kind of salute that doesn't come from habit, but from shared fire. The kind of salute reserved for those who have seen things that never made it to the front page. Behind them, the phone stopped recording. Not because the moment wasn't worth it, but because it felt wrong to watch something so sacred through a screen. The uniform sat between them now, draped awkwardly over the cold inspection table. Still partially folded, its navy fabric caught the overhead fluorescence with a softness that didn't match the sharp edge of the moment. The air in the lobby had shifted, no longer tense, but alert, charged, like everyone was holding their breath. Officer Rustin was the first to speak again, trying to reassert control. What's with all these mismatched pins? He asked, turning the jacket slightly. They don't make sense together. Different branches, different eras. This doesn't check out. He sounded more confused than accusatory now, but his voice still carried that faint smirk of a man clinging to doubt because the alternative felt too heavy to hold. Margaret didn't answer right away. She watched the jacket, not the man. Her eyes tracked a particular insignia as it shifted beneath his fingers, a small silver triangle above a black field. Subtle, almost forgettable, unless you knew what it meant. I don't expect you to understand, she said softly. Officer Lorette stepped closer, his expression less performative than before. He was squinting, trying to decipher the meanings layered into the fabric. That one, what's that patch? He asked, pointing. Margaret glanced at it briefly. That one was earned outside of any map you've ever been shown. And that should have sounded ridiculous, but it didn't. Rustin let out a dry chuckle. Look, Mom, anybody can buy a bunch of pins and stitch them onto an old coat. That doesn't make it military. That makes it cosplay. But even as he said it, his voice was starting to lose its bite. He turned back to the bag and reached again. More items came out. First, a small prescription bottle. The label was partially rubbed off, the name faded with age. He shook it slightly and listened to the pills rattle. Then, he pulled out a black and white photograph, carefully wrapped in 2 layers of wax paper. He began to peel it back. Don't, Margaret said quietly, but firmly. Please. He hesitated, but just for a beat, then unwrapped it anyway. The photograph showed a group of 11 people, all in uniform, standing in front of a dark, painted helicopter. The edges of the photo were curled from years of pressure. Some of the faces were marked with faint X, not scribbled in anger. Marked, remembered. Rustin blinked. This real. He passed it to Lorette, who didn't speak as he looked. The names of the soldiers were handwritten in pen on the back. Most only had first initials. One of them read, M.E. Carter lead. Rustin laid the photo down and reached back into the bag. Out came a book of poetry. Tennyson, well thumbed and worn. The pages inside were marked with annotations in tight, careful handwriting. Certain stanzas underlined more than once. He scoffed. Romantic poetry doesn't exactly scream covered up. Margaret didn't flinch. It kept me grounded, she said, when nothing else could. Next was a folded letter, its envelope sealed with wax. An old government seal embedded in the red, partially cracked, but still distinct. This some kind of antique? Lorette asked, almost respectfully. That was written by someone who died in 1974, Margaret said. It hasn't been opened since. They didn't press her on it. Then came a small key, brass, intricate, with filigree edges, clearly not for a house. It was delicate but heavy. Rustin turned it over in his gloved fingers. This open a locker somewhere. Known. A safe. No. Then what? Margaret took a breath, her eyes on the key. It opened something that should have stayed closed, but we were ordered otherwise. Silence. No one laughed this time. And then a box, small, wooden, dark cherry finish, aged and scratched on one corner. It had no markings, no hinges, just a lid. Rustin opened it, and inside was a single medal. No ribbon, no inscription. But the medal was unmistakably military grade. Matte black, shaped like a compass rose, with a single gold dot in the center. This isn't in any medal book I've ever seen. Lorette muttered. It wouldn't be. Margaret replied. Only 3 of us received it. 2 are buried in unmarked graves. 1 still standing. She didn't have to say who. The air thickened again. Even those behind the tape line, people waiting in line for license renewals or tax appointments, were quiet now. Phones were still up, but no one was smiling. A man near the back of the crowd, a veteran judging by his posture, spoke up, low but audible. That's not surplus. That patch, on the sleeve, it's from Dresden Hollow. That's Cold War Black Ops. I've seen a file once. Barely. Rustin snapped his head around. Sir, please step back. I'm just saying. The man replied, hands up. If that's what I think it is, you're not holding junk. You're holding history. Margaret's eyes dropped to the table, to all her things laid out in sterile order, exposed under unforgiving light. None of this was meant for display, she said, more to herself than anyone. We weren't meant to be remembered. Just useful. The line had stopped moving, no one minded. Officer Rustin shifted uncomfortably. He was still holding the uniform jacket when something clinked. One of the obscure medals had come loose, barely attached to begin with. It fell from the fabric and hit the metal table with a sharp clang, then bounced onto the floor. Margaret flinched. It was the first real emotion she'd shown since the inspection began. She stepped forward, not rushing but deliberate, and picked it up herself. She didn't brush it off. She just cradled it for a moment like something sacred. That was awarded after Dresden Hollow, she said softly. There were no citations, no parade, just silence and an oath. Rustin opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Lorette finally asked the question both had been circling. Who are you? Margaret didn't look at them. That's not really the question you're asking. Lorette nodded slowly. All right. Then what's the answer we need? Margaret took a moment, then reached toward the jacket, checked the name tag. Inside pocket. Rustin fumbled, found it. The thread was old, almost faded, but still legible. Sardar M.E. Compare that to the ID, Margaret said. They did. The numbers matched. Rustin blinked. These are real. They've always been real, she said. The crowd was murmuring now, shifting. What started as mockery had become myth made flesh. The medal rested quietly in her palm. The light in the atrium had shifted. Outside, the clouds were starting to part, spilling thin rays of sunlight through the long windows above the security checkpoint. The fluorescent buzz inside felt almost irrelevant now. Margaret Elaine Carter didn't move. She held the fallen medal as if it were made of glass. Then, after a pause, she pinned it back onto the navy blue uniform, right where it belonged. No one said a word. Even Officer Rustin, who just minutes ago had sneered at the idea that anything in her duffel meant something, was now standing a little straighter. His gloves still on, his fingers slightly trembling, he looked over at Officer Lorette, who had stopped pretending he wasn't rattled. What exactly is all this? Lorette muttered. None of this is normal. Margaret finally looked up. That's correct. Before either officer could speak again, the glass doors at the side of the atrium whispered open, and through them stepped a man who didn't need to speak to command a room. He wore the dark blue of formal military dress. His back was impossibly straight, his chin high, the chest of his jacket heavy with ribbons, service bars, and medals. The stars on his shoulder, 4 of them, glinted with unmistakable authority. 2 junior officers followed a pace behind him, in similar dress, but neither spoke nor looked around. They didn't need to. Everyone had already turned. Officer Rustin noticed the insignia and stood up taller, unconsciously pulling his gloves off. He took 1 step forward. Sir, this is a secured checkpoint. We were conducting a... The man didn't even glance at him. He walked straight to the table. His eyes were focused only on Margaret, and when he stopped, just 2 feet away, he said her name in a voice that didn't shake. Captain Carter. The entire checkpoint went still. People forgot they were holding phones. A woman near the front of the crowd lowered hers slowly, like witnessing something sacred. It's been? What? He said gently. 40 years? Margaret nodded. Her lips barely moved. 41. And then he saluted. A full, formal, precise salute. Not polite, not ceremonial, personal. The kind of salute only one soldier gives to another when both know exactly what it cost. Margaret didn't hesitate. She returned it. Perfectly. The silence held. You could hear the hum of the security scanners still cycling. You could hear a child somewhere across the lobby ask, "Why did he do that?" And a mother, just as confused, whisper back, "I don't know." General Malcolm Crane, Lorette muttered under his breath. But now, even he was unsure of his footing. The general stepped closer, his voice loud enough for the officers and the growing crowd to hear. You're holding Captain Carter's uniform, officer. I suggest you return it with the same care she used to preserve it for 4 decades. Rustin glanced down at the uniform still clutched in his arms, suddenly hyper-aware of every fold, every pin, every insignia he didn't understand. Why, yes, sir. Of course. He began to refold it awkwardly, trying not to let the fabric slip from his fingers. Sir, we had no idea. She didn't tell us. Crane cut him off with a quiet but firm tone. Her file was only declassified last month. You wouldn't have found anything even if you knew what to look for. He turned to Margaret again, and this time his expression softened. We're late, he said. The others are already waiting. Margaret gave the faintest smile. Some habits are hard to break. Crane nodded once, then turned to the 2 officers. Captain Carter will be receiving the Distinguished Service Cross today, alongside the 4 other surviving members of Special Operations Group Delta. Someone in the crowd gasped. A man near the middle of the group whispered, "That's the one they said didn't exist." "Yes," Crane said, overhearing. "That one." Lorette stepped back from the table. He looked over the items again, not just with confusion now, but with a dawning kind of reverence. He pointed to the book of poetry. What was she? He asked, almost to himself. An intelligence officer. Crane answered calmly. She was more than that. Group Delta operated behind enemy lines during operations the U.S. government still refuses to fully acknowledge. Their primary missions involved extraction, infiltration, and altering the course of conflict without ever officially existing. Rustin's voice cracked slightly, but women weren't even allowed in. Officially, Crane cut in. Margaret looked directly at Rustin now. Her gaze didn't accuse, it didn't shame, but it held him. Officially, we didn't exist either. Rustin nodded slowly. Understood, the atmosphere had fully shifted. Where before there had been mockery and doubt, now there was awe, and guilt, and something quieter, a deep, aching respect. Crane nodded to one of his junior officers who stepped forward with a black velvet box. Captain Carter, the ceremony begins in 20 minutes. The President will be presenting your decoration personally. The final approvals came through this morning. Margaret took a deep breath, her fingers brushing against the sleeve of the uniform. I never wanted a medal. And that's why you deserve it. Crane gestured toward the elevators. Will you walk with me? Margaret nodded, but before turning, she looked down at the table one last time, her bag still open, her belongings laid bare for the world to see. She reached for each item and repacked it herself. Rustin made a move to assist, but she stopped him with a quiet look. These things were never meant to be displayed, just carried. She zipped the duffel closed, lifted it slowly, and stood upright. Before stepping away, she turned to Officer Rustin. He braced, expecting judgment. Instead, she said, "Isn't earned by a badge or a stripe. It's earned by how you treat people, especially when you think they're no one." Her voice didn't rise, but it reached everyone. The crowd held still. Even the phones had dropped, and somewhere in the back of the line, an older man nodded to himself and whispered, "We never know who we're standing next to." Crane offered her his arm. She declined, walking beside him, not behind, not supported, equal. And as the glass doors closed behind them and the sun broke fully through the clouds, the lobby of that government building remained quiet for a long time. No one quite knew what to do, because something holy had just happened, and no one had seen it coming. Dignity isn't about feeling worthy. It's how you take back the power to not be diminished. The elevator doors closed slowly behind them, muffling the chatter, the awkward silences, and the clinking of badges back at the checkpoint. Margaret Carter stood still, her duffel at her side, her uniform neatly folded in her arms. General Crane didn't speak at first. He stood with her in the quiet, giving her space not out of politeness, but out of understanding. Some silences didn't need to be filled. They were earned. The elevator rose steadily toward the top floor. Above them, sunlight had begun to filter through the tall windows of the ceremonial hall, now prepared for something long overdue. Margaret adjusted her grip on the uniform. Her hands moved with practiced care, not out of vanity, but out of reverence. These weren't just clothes. They were a ledger of the people she'd lost. "Do you think they'll believe it?" she asked quietly. Crane looked at her reflection in the mirrored wall. "They don't need to believe it," he replied. "They just need to remember what believing cost us." She gave a nod, barely perceptible. The room wasn't filled with press. There were no flashing cameras, no national broadcasts. But every seat was taken. A quiet reverence filled the air as military personnel, government officials, and a handful of selected family members waited in silence. A row of aged veterans sat near the front, men and women with lined faces and shoulders that still sat straighter than most civilians ever could. At the head of the room stood a simple podium. Behind it, the Distinguished Service Cross was displayed on velvet. A single flag flanked the presentation area. No banners, no music, just quiet. Margaret took her place among the 4 other surviving members of Special Operations Group Delta. Most she hadn't seen in decades. Some were thinner. Others now used canes. One wore sunglasses indoors, likely to mask what age had taken from him. They greeted her not with words, but with nods. Small, heavy nods. The kind that carry more history than introductions ever could. "You made it?" whispered Commander Malcolm Reed beside her. "Most of me," Margaret replied. "That's enough," said a woman named Ella Foster. "The rest of us are carrying pieces of the ones who didn't." The room stood as the president entered, flanked by military officials. He walked slowly and without flair, a man not here for applause, but for atonement. He stepped behind the podium, looked out over the crowd, and then toward the 5 veterans seated before him. "Today," he began, "we are here to recognize what should have been acknowledged long ago. Not just the bravery of these individuals, but the very existence of their sacrifice." His voice was steady, quiet. He didn't gesture theatrically. He didn't make it about politics. Captain Margaret Carter and her team were sent into places we denied being. They completed missions we never admitted happened, and they did so not for glory, but because they were asked, and they answered. The president turned toward Margaret and picked up the medal for extraordinary heroism in the face of unspeakable danger, and for actions that prevented the deaths of 37 civilians during Operation Dresden Hollow. Captain Margaret Carter is awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. He pinned the medal onto her re-pressed uniform. Margaret didn't smile. She stood straight, gave a formal salute, and received one in return. Then she stepped back. There were no standing ovations, no weeping, just a kind of stillness, the kind that filled a space like incense in a chapel. Not mourning, not celebration, just quiet truth. Later, after the formalities faded and the mingling began, Margaret found herself standing alone at the edge of the room, a glass of water in her hand. Her uniform now hung gently over her forearm, the metal resting where it belonged. She didn't speak much during the reception. Others talked of dates and files and places now declassified. She listened. She remembered. But she didn't offer stories. Some truths weren't meant to be told to strangers with cocktails. She was just about to leave when someone approached her cautiously from the side. It was the young security officer from the checkpoint, the only one who had looked uncomfortable while the others mocked. She wasn't in uniform now. Civilian clothes, nervous hands. "Mom," she said quietly. Margaret turned. "Officer Ellis," she said. Adira Ellis looked stunned. She was remembered. She straightened instinctively. I wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened down there." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "You didn't search my bag." "No. But I didn't stop it either. I just stood there. I saw what was happening and you saw it?" Margaret interrupted gently. "That's more than most do." There was a pause. Adira swallowed, then asked, "How did you deal with it? The disrespect, the way they looked at you." Especially back then, being a woman in that kind of role, it must have been so much worse. Margaret didn't rush to answer. When she did, her voice was lower. With dignity, Adira frowned. "Because you felt you deserved it?" "No," Margaret said. "Because maintaining dignity denies others the power to diminish you, even when you don't feel strong, especially then. So, it's like armor." Margaret nodded, not to hide behind, but to stand within. Adira looked down for a moment, then back up. "Will you ever tell the full story? What really happened in that operation?" Margaret turned toward the wide windows at the back of the room. Beyond them, the sun had broken through fully now. The world below looked quiet, clean. Some things belong only to those who live them. Adira waited, but Margaret said nothing more. The silence wasn't frustrating, it was final. And in it, Adira understood. As they parted, Adira paused again and asked, "Can I ask one more thing?" "You may." "Why did you join?" "Why do that kind of work knowing no one would ever know?" Margaret looked her in the eyes. "Because someone had to. And because being unseen didn't make it unimportant." She stepped past, then paused one last time. "Officer Ellis," she said, without turning. "Yes." "You don't need a title to act with integrity, or a uniform to serve." Adira stood there long after Margaret walked away, her thoughts louder than any conversation around her. Margaret Carter stepped outside into a city that would never know what she had done for it. No parade, no monuments, just a clean sidewalk, and the long shadow of the afternoon sun stretching out beside her. Behind her, in a hall full of records, finally unsealed, her name would be etched onto a plaque, small, understated. But for those who knew, it would be enough. She walked on, bag at her side, medal in place, head high, not for attention, just for balance. Sometimes the loudest people in the room are the ones least worth listening to. And sometimes the quietest person, the one you pass in line, ignore at the store, or overlook at the bus stop, is someone who once carried the weight of the world so that others could walk freely. Captain Margaret Carter didn't ask for applause. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even try to correct those who mocked her. But when it mattered, when the truth finally stepped forward, it didn't arrive with sirens or speeches. It came with a folded uniform, a fallen medal, and a salute no one expected. She taught us something timeless. Maintaining dignity isn't about being proud. It's about not letting the world decide your worth for you. In a time where shouting often drowns out listening, in a world that values spotlight more than sacrifice, this story reminds us that you don't need recognition to matter. You don't need applause to have made a difference. And you don't need to be famous to be honorable. We all carry stories. Some are known, many are forgotten, but all deserve respect. What about you? Have you ever met someone who turned out to be far more than they first appeared? Have you ever been underestimated simply because others couldn't see your full story? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and this is a space where quiet stories matter. If this story moved you, we tell stories like this because they deserve to be told. Stories of unsung heroes, of dignity under pressure, of people who chose duty over recognition. If you believe these stories still matter in today's world, if you think truth without noise still has a place in our hearts, subscribe. Let's make sure these quiet legacies are never silenced again. Because sometimes, the most powerful salute comes without a single word.